Cross-examination.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, Dr. Becker.
Good morning, Ms. White.
As we ended yesterday, we were talking about a couple of things, and I think I'd like to start by narrowing the issues that we're dealing with in the case, okay? One of the last things was an exhibit presented by Mr. Boyle of the temple that Jeffrey Dahmer drew, correct? Yes. Now, I think you indicated that that was of interest to you because it was psychotic-like, correct?
That's correct.
However, ultimately, after your examination, you could not find any evidence, or you could not find sufficient evidence to support a diagnosis of psychosis on the part of Jeffrey Dahmer, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Another thing that could be an issue in the case is whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer had the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe you indicated on direct that you made a finding to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty that at all relevant times Jeffrey Dahmer could understand the wrongfulness of his conduct, correct?
That's correct.
And what did you base that on?
I based that on both questions that I asked him several times in meeting with him, and that is, did he know that it was wrong to take a person's life? And he indicated when I asked him that he knew that it was wrong to do that.
Okay. So essentially, the issues that we're left with, to your understanding, are whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer suffered from a mental disease.
That's correct.
And whether or not that mental disease substantially impaired his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, correct?
Those two issues were what we were left with.
Okay. Let's first talk briefly about mental disease. The mental disease that you diagnosed was paraphilia?
It was necrophilia, which is a form of paraphilia.
All right. Now,
Excuse me, I'm going to ask the doctor, you pull the mic up a little higher, I think we're just losing a little. That's great. That's fine.
Okay.
All right. Now, I think, and I may have misheard you, that at the end of the testimony yesterday, you indicated that not all necrophilics have a mental disease. Is that correct?
That is what I said, and would you like me to explain that?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right. In order to make the diagnosis of necrophilia, a person has to have either acted, that is, they have intense sexual fantasies or urges. Number one, that they have acted on, or number two, that they are distressed by. Hypothetically, there can be people out there who on occasion have thoughts or are attracted to thoughts about being sexual with corpses, but they might not have ever acted on those urges, and they might not be distressed by them. And in that case, I would not call that a mental disease.
All right. So the fantasy or the urge becomes a mental disease because of the distress and or the act itself.
That's correct.
Okay. I just want to refer to one other thing. This is Defendant's Exhibit 27. Concerning, why don't you identify this to the jury?
Okay. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the third version, and it's been revised. And this is what is used to make diagnosis in the field of mental health.
And indeed, the committee concerning paraphilia is the committee on which you serve in this.
That's correct.
There's also a cautionary statement concerning the categories in this manual, is that correct?
That's correct.
And does this cautionary statement, could you start with if to the word disability? Does that appear?
It says, it is to be understood that inclusion here for clinical and research purposes of a diagnostic category, such as pathological gambling or pedophilia, does not imply that the condition meets legal or other non-medical criteria for what constitutes mental disease, mental disorder, or mental disability.
All right. Now, it would still be fair to substitute the word necrophilia for pedophilia in that cautionary statement, would it not?
Well, it was not substituted in there, so I would not feel comfortable saying it would be fair to do that.
All right. So, in other words, of the paraphilias, only pedophilia that cautionary statement applies to?
Again,
Or is that just, I'm sorry, or is that just an example?
I did not write the cautionary statement, and so it's difficult for me to know if that is just one example that they meant. They didn't list the other forms of paraphilia.
All right. Could you read that statement once again?
Sure. It is to be understood that inclusion here for clinical and research purposes of a diagnostic category such as pathological gambling or pedophilia does not imply that the condition meets legal or other non-medical criteria of what constitutes mental disease, mental disorder, or mental disability.
All right. Now, having reread that, the words such as a diagnostic category, does that not indicate to you that they're listing examples?
That could be interpreted that way.
Fine. Do you agree that psychiatrists and psychologists differ on whether or not a paraphilia is a mental disease for legal purposes?
I do.
But let's talk about the specific paraphilia here, necrophilia, which you, in your report, indicated you considered, in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, a mental disease, okay?
Yes.
First, in talking about paraphilias, in shorthand, is the major difference between paraphilias and normal sexual desires the object of that sexual desire?
Indeed.
Okay. So in other words, if someone is intensely sexually attracted, a man's intensely sexually attracted to a redheaded woman, that's not a paraphilia.
As long as it's an adult male and adult female and she consents to be, just the attraction in itself would not be considered a paraphilia.
Okay. However, if an adult male is intensely sexually attracted to, and I'm not trying to be facetious, instead of red hair, red shoes, that's a paraphilia.
Well, it would be diagnosed as a paraphilia if he had a fetish. We would call that a fetish, perhaps, okay? So if he held on to the red shoes, if he used it to masturbate, if he acted on that attraction, or if he was markedly distressed by his interest in red shoes.
Okay. However, going back, you said markedly distressed. If the distress or the action is what makes it a mental disease, but a man could have, without being mentally diseased, thoughts or fantasies concerning these shoes, correct?
A person could have thoughts or fantasies about shoes, and if it didn't bother them or if they didn't do something with the shoes, we wouldn't diagnose them as having a fetish, which is a paraphilia.
Okay. But again, the major point is it's the difference in the nature of the object that's it's the difference in the nature of what is the object of the intense sexual desire, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, when you were talking specifically about Mr. Dahmer yesterday, you indeed indicated, I believe at one point, that you were almost uncomfortable with the word necrophilia as a complete diagnosis because you didn't have a term for his sexual attraction to the unconscious, sleeping, breathing man with a heartbeat, correct?
That's correct. In searching the literature, I could not find a philia listed to define attraction to someone who is placed in a comatose state and is in a coma when you're doing something sexual to them.
All right. But you indicated that essentially, other than the fact that the man in the comatose state was breathing and had a heartbeat, and the deceased was a corpse, that for the purposes of the definition, it essentially made no difference, correct?
Well, the fact is the person was out. They could not interact with Jeffrey.
All right. So for the purposes of the definition you came up with, that did not make a big difference, correct?
Well, in terms of, I made the diagnosis of necrophilia on two things. One, his behaviors, that is that he did engage in sexual activity with a number of corpses. Two, he reported to me that 25% of his erotic interest pattern was to being sexual with a corpse. So it was on both those factors.
That's true, but he also reported that 75% was to the comatose person,
That's correct. That's what he self-reported.
Now, while for the purposes of your ultimate definition or diagnosis of mental disease, that did not make a difference. The difference between the person who was breathing and with a heartbeat and the corpse was a homicide occurring, correct?
That's correct.
And Mr. Dahmer's responsibility in taking a person from stage 1 to stage 2 is the entire issue in this case, correct?
That's correct.
So there, the distinction is legally very important.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, let's actually, it starts right on the bottom of page 18, and we're talking about Mr. Dahmer's 8th victim, Ernest Miller. And starting with the last word there, is this how it reads? He propositioned him and then went with him to his apartment. He had only a few pills available. While he, this would be Ernest Miller, was asleep, he thought, how should I keep him? He did not want to put this person through any pain, and consequently he stabbed him in the jugular. He reported that the victim died quickly. Mr. Dahmer reported that he had to consume alcoholic beverages before he was able to stab the person. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, visualizing that moment in time, am I correct that what we have here is a live, sleeping, comatose man? And Mr. Dahmer, according to what he reported to you, says, how shall I keep him? Because he doesn't have enough pills, is afraid he'll wake up if he strangles him. And at that moment, Mr. Dahmer reaches outside himself to get alcohol to diminish his resistance to killing, and then gets a knife after he's consumed alcohol and cuts the throat of Ernest Miller. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Right. So, Mr. Dahmer, who indicated to you that, and I believe indicated throughout his interviews, that the actual act of killing was distasteful to him and he'd seek the aid of alcohol in doing it, used alcohol here to help impair his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of law. Isn't that correct?
In the case of Ernest Miller, he reported to me that indeed he took alcohol because he wanted to keep this person, and he didn't have the pills available to do it, and so he needed to stab him, and drinking helped him feel better about stabbing Ernest Miller.
It helped him feel better and helped him impair his ability
Yes.
to conform his conduct to the requirements of law.
That's correct.
true. Okay. All right. Now, let's refer to page 16 in your notes. Early on in that page, when there's the continuation of his description to you of what occurred with James Doxeter, who's referred to as victim number 3, but is actually the first charged victim here. Mr. Dahmer reports to you that his compulsion was in full swing at this time, correct?
Ms. White, could you just tell me where on page 16?
I'm
that-
very sorry.
It's okay.
The top partial paragraph, the next to the last line. His compulsion was in full swing at this time.
Okay, according to Mr. Dahmer, right, I have
That's
it.
correct. Okay. That's what he says at the time that he has killed James Doxeter, the first charged victim.
That's what he reported to me, that's correct.
However, later on, and we're now going to deal with the end of the second paragraph, after he has killed Richard Guerrero, yet another killing, he reports the following. He reports the incident with the juvenile, SS, in this case, and that in that case, he did not plan to kill him, the juvenile. The reason he did not plan to kill him was that he had to go to work that night, and that helped him control his compulsion, correct?
That's what he reported.
All right. So, although he reported that his compulsion was in full swing after he had killed James Doxeter, he killed yet another person, and then later, because he had to go to work, was able to conform his conduct to the requirements of law and not kill a drugged victim, correct?
Ms. White, that's what he reported was the reason why he didn't kill him. I can't say that that is the reason, but that's what Jeffrey reported.
All right. The fact remains, does it not, that that man remained alive, correct?
That's correct.
And therefore, Jeffrey Dahmer's interaction with that man, while in the full swing of his compulsion, conformed to the requirements of law, did it not?
In that case, he did not commit a homicide. That's correct.
Let's move on to an even more interesting incident, perhaps. It would be on page 18. And here we're dealing with the juvenile LP, the man that Mr. Dahmer, it's the central paragraph there.
Right.
The man that Mr. Dahmer reported that he had at his apartment, that he struck with a mallet and indeed tried to strangle. First of all, you read the statement of Mr. Dahmer that was supplied to you, correct?
His confession made
Yes.
to the police, yes.
Okay. And the version here differs somewhat from the statement as it was provided to you in that statement, Mr. Dahmer reports that this person came back voluntarily with him to his apartment on one day. He released him knowing that they'd meet the next day, and that the incident described here with the mallet and the attempted strangulation all occur on the second meeting.
Yes.
All right. Now, that first day when there is contact between Mr. Dahmer and LP, and this, I believe, so we can put it in time, is after he has killed his 6th victim. This day, Mr. Dahmer conforms his conduct to the requirements of law the first day and releases the man to meet him the next day, correct?
Correct.
Now, on the second day, we have the following incident according to his report. Mr. Dahmer did not have any pills available to him that weekend. Mr. Dahmer went to an Army surplus store and bought a mallet. He took pictures and had him, that being LP, lay on his stomach, struck him in the back of the neck with the mallet. The guy got up, first of all, stopping there, do you believe that was an attempt by Mr. Dahmer to kill LP?
I don't know if it was an attempt to kill him. It was an attempt certainly to knock him out and render him unconscious.
Okay. The guy got up and attempted to leave the apartment and said he would call the police. The guy left and then came back in and asked Mr. Dahmer for money for a cab. Mr. Dahmer tried to strangle him at this point. That is an attempt to kill him, is
Yes.
it not? But then calmed down, and they both went into the bedroom. All right? Let's go to the last portion of that. We have a moment in time again. When here, Mr. Dahmer has a juvenile, LP, who's indicated he's going to leave him. Mr. Dahmer has, from his description, his hands around his throat and is attempting to extinguish that man's life. And at that moment, he conforms his conduct to the requirements of law and stops, correct?
Correct. He did not strangle LP.
So, would you say that in that case, Mr. Dahmer was responsible?
I think, Ms. White, what I'd be comfortable in saying is because of the struggle, excuse me, Jeffrey saw that he was not going to be able to win this struggle, and at that point, stopped struggling.
All right. In other words, if he can't win the fight, he can control his conduct, conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
I'm not saying that in all cases. I'm saying that in regard to LP, it didn't work out the way Jeffrey envisioned it working out in terms of what his fantasies were and what he does with his victims. And there was a struggle.
Dr. Becker, let's go through it this way then. In the case of LP, because he couldn't win the struggle, he was able to conform his conduct to the requirements of law and not kill, correct?
He did not kill LP.
He was able to conform his conduct to the requirements of law in not killing him, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In the case of SS, because he had to get to work, he was able to conform his conduct to the requirements of law and not kill him, correct?
Ms. White, if I can say that he did not kill the person you just mentioned, but I don't know that I believe that it was because he had to get to work.
All right.
But the fact is, that's what he said.
He did not kill him.
And he did not kill him.
In his interaction, where he had drugged SS, as he had drugged his other victims, in his interaction with the SS, which you'll admit was sexual interaction, he conformed his conduct to the requirements of law. His reported reason was he had to get to work, but for some reason,
He didn't.
did not kill him and therefore was able to conform his conduct to the
Correct.
requirements of law. Let's go on to, I believe this is page 20. Right after Mr. Dahmer has reported killing his 9th victim, David Thomas, and here he says he went to Chicago for a vacation and met a man at a bath club. The man was black. They went back to his apartment and Mr. Dahmer drugged him. Mr. Dahmer stated that for some reason he did not do anything else. He just masturbated and kissed the guy and the guy left. He did not kill this man, and he felt that it might be that he was not as, I think that should read, it says as not, was not as attracted to him as he thought he would be, correct?
That's correct.
So in this case, after having killed his 9th victim, while involved in sexual interaction with a man that he met at a bath club, having that man back at his apartment where he has killed several victims already, having him drugged, he conforms his conduct to the requirements of law and does not kill, correct?
That's correct.
Which page is that, please?
It's 20.
20.
It's page 20, the first full paragraph.
Actually, yes, that's right, it's the first full paragraph. Okay. Now, there was one incident here, I believe, that may not be reflected in your notes, but are you aware of the incident in West Allis at his grandmother's house where that involved a person whose name I can use since he's an adult, Ronald Flowers?
I'm aware of that. I did not obtain that information from Jeffrey, but from the police reports.
Okay. That incident from the police reports, which were Mr. Dahmer's statement, included the description of him having the person at his grandmother's house, having the person drugged, having the person in his planning. He'd crushed the pills before he left, just as he did, we'll take Anthony Sears in this case, whose incident he did report. He'd crushed the pills ahead of time, just as he had with Anthony Sears, correct?
Correct.
And from your reading of the confession and his report to you concerning Anthony Sears, in each case, he had the two of them driven to the vicinity of his grandmother's house, but dropped off some distance from it, so he couldn't be traced to his grandmother's house, correct?
That's my understanding.
And in each case, the person was drugged and helpless inside the grandmother's house, is that correct?
That's correct.
Because the grandmother saw Ronald Flowers, according to Mr. Dahmer's report to the police, he did not kill him, but he did kill Anthony Sears, correct?
Correct.
So when he interacted with Ronald Flowers, he was able, in regard to the homicide, to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, correct?
Ms. White, if I can just say that, again, that I did not discuss Mr. Flowers with Jeffrey, but based on what I read in the police reports, in that case, he conformed his conduct.
Okay, and what you read in the police reports were Mr. Dahmer's report of what had occurred?
Correct.
Now, you've indicated that at the time of each of the charged homicides, that it's your opinion that Mr. Dahmer was unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, correct?
That's correct.
I've discussed a number of incidents surrounding a number of the homicides where he did conform his conduct to the requirements of law, correct?
Yes, you did. Yes.
So his responsibility, or the way we know whether or not he's responsible, is the fact that when someone dies, he's not, correct?
Let me see if I understand what you're saying. Am I saying that he is only not responsible for his behavior when a person dies?
What I'm saying is the way we know that he's not able to conform his conduct to the requirements of law is that when he's not, we have a dead body. Someone dies, correct?
That's correct.
So that's the one differing factor, correct?
I just want to make the distinction here that I'm not saying that he doesn't have a paraphilia in those other cases, but he violates the law when he takes someone's life.
Okay, that's, we're not talking about the mental disease. I was on the second prong, and I'm glad you brought that up. Let's go back to the incident with LP. Jeffrey Dahmer has his hands around LP's throat and is attempting to kill LP, and he's attempting to kill LP to continue LP's presence with him because of his paraphilia, correct?
That's correct.
While in the act of strangling LP, Mr. Dahmer finds the ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of law and does not kill him, correct?
He doesn't kill him. I don't know that I would be comfortable saying that he finds the strength to conform his conduct. I think he lost the struggle with LP. I think he saw he was not going to be able to kill him and then have the body and do what he wanted with the body.
So he doesn't kill him and his conduct conforms to the requirements of law, correct?
He doesn't kill him, right.
Okay. Had he won the struggle at that time, at that same moment in time, and LP were another victim, would it be your conclusion that he lacked the capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
Yes.
Therefore, the result, the death itself, is what ultimately tells you that he was unable to conform his conduct, correct?
Correct.
Have a few more things. May I have just a moment? Back on the LP incident, were you aware, either from Mr. Dahmer or any other source, that at one point he had LP bound with a cord?
I recall reading that, and I think it was in the police report.
So a person who was bound wound up living at that particular point, from Mr. Dahmer's report, either to you or to the police, correct?
I'm sorry, your statement was the person
bound
wound up living.
Right.
That's
A person who was bound either from Mr. Dahmer's report to the police or report to you wound up living in that particular case, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you're aware, are you not, that when asked, Mr. Dahmer indicated that the reason for these homicides was his own warped, selfish desire for self-gratification. That's the way he phrased it, correct?
That's correct.
And by reason there, we're talking about his motive in doing what he did, correct?
When he makes that statement, is he telling us why he did what he did?
Yes.
Yes.
And indeed, in your report of his statements, we have, I'm sorry, your reports of his statement, we have on page 12, for example, on the bottom, that he reported he started using the sleeping pills during this period because some guys wanted to perform anal sex and he did not want to. This was a way of keeping them. Specifically, Mr. Dahmer did not want to be the recipient of anal sex, and consequently, if he were to drug the person, they would then fall asleep and he would not have to participate in anal sex where he was the receptive partner. Correct?
That's what he said.
Okay. That's choice, that the sexual activity will be his way without taking into consideration the needs or desires of the other person could be defined as a selfish choice, could it not?
Yes, it could.
I refer you to page 24. This would be toward the end of the third complete paragraph. I asked Mr. Dahmer again why he killed his victims. He reported he did not just drug them and have sex with them and let them leave because he wanted to keep them, he wanted them to stay with him. In other words, Mr. Dahmer reported that while he drew sexual pleasure from these people while they were alive and comatose, his ultimate choice to do the act of killing was to extend his period of sexual pleasure with them, correct?
That's correct.
And he did indicate to you that the act of killing itself was not what gave him gratification, correct?
That's correct.
And that indeed he drank in order to make himself more able to do that actual act of homicide, correct?
That's what he reported.
Now, Mr. Dahmer, in doing this, in taking a person's life so that he would have a longer period of sexual pleasure with that person, was doing a selfish act, was he not?
Yes, he was.
If Mr. Dahmer reported to you that I drugged the person and and had sex with them. And then I killed them. But I'm not a necrophiliac. I have whatever philia it would have been that he's only aroused to comatose bodies. But I killed them because this would be a living witness. I killed the witness. Would you hold him responsible for that homicidal act?
Okay, he drugged a person, he had sex with them
Right.
while they were
He's got that
comatose.
paraphilia, the comatose paraphilia.
The comatose one, okay.
And then while the person is drugged, he kills that person. And he says, and the reason I kill that person is no sex afterwards. The reason I kill that person now is because I've already done a criminal act, and if that person is alive, they're going to report me to the police. So now I'm getting rid of the witness. Okay. Would you hold him responsible for that act of homicide?
Yes, I would.
Ma'am, isn't the only difference between that and this the fact that he had a sexual motivation as well as getting rid of the evidence that led him to extend his period of time with the person?
The nature of his,
Excuse me, I think that was a yes or no question.
could you repeat it?
Excuse me, Judge, that's just not fair. This witness, in response to this question, is about to give an answer. She should be allowed to give it, and if it doesn't meet, she can move that to be stricken. She can't stop her from starting the answer. It's just not fair.
Objections overruled. I think that initially the witness can answer in a yes or no manner, and then if the examiner wishes for an explanation, the examiner can ask for that explanation. If the examiner does not ask for an explanation, the attorney who presented the witness in redirect may ask for the explanation.
Would you repeat the question then?
I think she's the one that's supposed to ask, but sure.
And I'm supposed to answer yes or no?
But no, I haven't heard the question. I want to hear the question. So because I have to...
Let's go back to what we had before.
I might say this, I think any witness has the right, when asked to answer a question yes or no, to say simply, I am unable to answer it that way. And then, and then the questioner will just have to go on with...
I understand, but I really do want to have that last question read back, so I'm prepared to ask it and redirect. Would you read the question back, Madam
Fine.
Clerk?
Just a second.
Do you want to rephrase it? Or do you want to read it?
I believe the question I asked, which preceded it, was whether or not, if Jeffrey Dahmer had sexual interaction with a comatose person that he drugged, and then killed that comatose person, deriving no pleasure from the killing, and indicated that the reason he had killed that person was to get rid of the witness, would he be responsible for that act? And your answer to that was yes, he would be.
Yes.
The difference between that scenario and Jeffrey Dahmer's killing to keep them for some extended pleasure is the motive for the killing, correct?
Correct.
Just a second. Okay, I only have two other very brief things. One, yesterday, at the close of the day, you indicated that Mr. Dahmer had reported some additional necrophilic acts to you in your most recent interview. I just need to know when that interview took place.
I arrived here, I believed it was on Sunday, and went to the prison and spent, it was anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half with Jeffrey to ask some further questions, and it was at that time.
All right. And ma'am, were you alone with him? Was Dr. Berlin with you?
Dr. Berlin was with me, and also one of his attorneys.
Okay. Now, I just need to ask one more thing that I noticed yesterday. Yesterday, you did spend some considerable time at Mr. Boyle's request reading the 26 pages of the in-depth interview
Right.
you took with Mr. Dahmer. These are your notes, ma'am. Make sure I got Now, Dr. Becker, you have testified previously in courts, but I think we established that that was concerning evaluation and treatment, very often of sexual offenders, and their reintegration perhaps into the community, correct?
That's correct.
And this is the first time you've testified on the responsibility issue in any case, and particularly in a homicide case,
That's correct.
All right. Now, you read your notes virtually verbatim yesterday, correct?
That's correct.
In looking at your notes, are you aware, ma'am, that the name Jeff or Jeffrey never appears? It's always Mr.
Mr.
Dahmer.
Dahmer, that's correct.
Are you aware that you continuously changed the name to Jeff or Jeffrey?
Your pointing it out makes me aware that I did that.
So until now, you have not been aware of that? Until I just pointed it out?
I mean, when I was reading it yesterday, I saw Mr. Dahmer, but I said Jeffrey.
Okay. Ma'am, you're a psychologist. Do you think that shows a certain psychological closeness you've developed with the defendant?
No, it does not. I mean, it could be interpreted that way, but I don't think that's the case.
Okay. You looked at the words Mr. Dahmer.
Yes.
And the name Jeff or Jeffrey came out of your mouth, but you don't believe that's because of any particular closeness you feel for him?
I do not.
I have nothing further, but thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, you weren't told to do that, were you? You weren't told to personalize the calling?
No, I was not.
Now, we're talking about acts of homicide here. And I just want to ask you a few questions in light of this White's cross-examination. She asked you to assume that the reason in her assumption that this person killed after having sex with a comatose person was to get rid of a witness that could testify against him.
That's correct.
You believe that is the reason that Mr. Dahmer killed?
I do not.
So that assumption that was asked of you was that if a person was suffering from the mental disease that you have attributed to Mr. Dahmer, and that his object of his fantasy was simply to have sex with a person who he rendered comatose, and after having all of that sex, he then killed the person. As it related to that homicide, he wouldn't be non-responsible.
If Mr. Boyle, if I may say something, because I had to answer that yes or no.
Sure.
That was a hypothetical, and the fact is that if an individual did that, I mean, that person would have to be thoroughly evaluated, because the fact is you might have a psychotic individual who then might not be responsible for having done that. Hypotheticals make me uncomfortable.
But in the hypothetical that Ms. White was asking, she put in a pretty interesting fact that the only reason for the killing was to get rid of the witness. Now, we don't have that here, do we?
We do not.
So although in the abstract your answers were directed to her question, that assumption is not the question before you, as it has been in your cross and direct examination, as to Jeffrey Dahmer's mental responsibility as it relates to his acts of homicide.
That's correct.
The witness has used the term hypothetical question, and I think maybe it might be helpful to the jurors if I instruct them right now a little bit about what a
Fine.
hypothetical
Sure,
question
sure.
is,
Thank you.
because some witnesses are allowed to answer a question that we call a hypothetical question. Now, a hypothetical question is where a witness is asked to assume certain facts as being true, and from those assumptions to draw as to what conclusions they would draw. Now, a hypothetical question is only valid to the extent that the assumptions are valid. And you, the jurors, are the ones, based on the testimony in this case, that have to decide the validity of those assumptions. Go ahead, Mr. Coates.
Sure. Judge, Doctor, one of the things I neglected to ask you in direct was, you and I have entered into a retainer agreement.
Yes.
Would you tell us, for the record, what the sum and substance of that is?
Yes, that I am to receive $5,000 plus whatever my expenses are.
Let's talk about filias. Have you ever found a filia, a necrophilia that you've told us? You looked to see if there was a filia of someone that was, amongst other things, wanting to render someone comatose in order to have sex.
Correct.
And what did you do to determine whether or not there was such a filia in existence? By name.
I reviewed the literature in this area.
Did you find any that fit?
No.
Did you go back to necrophilia? What's necro mean?
A corpse.
Okay. What's isn't that a Greek word? It's a derivative
Yes.
of a Greek word? Is there a derivative of a Greek word for a person who is also, besides being a necrophilia, wants to have a comatose philia?
I'm not all that familiar with Greek and don't have a Greek dictionary available to me. So if we were to derive one, it would be whatever the Greek word for coma is and philia at the end of it.
Okay, now, in the literature and in the Bible of the DSM, I call it Bible, but the DSM 3R, have you reviewed that to decide whether or not we know the necrophilia is in here?
Yes, it is.
Now, do you have you searched there to see if there has been instances sufficiently reported that the people who put together the DSMR looked for a person who had a paraphilia, and that paraphilia also included or was singularly for having sex by making someone comatose and having sex with them? Is there one in there?
It's not mentioned.
You keep on using the word Jeffrey reported, as you have testified. Now, when Mr. Dahmer was telling you things, you would mark down what he was saying, and then in many of your responses, he said he reported things to you.
That's correct.
Now, if Mr. Dahmer, assume that Mr. Dahmer was psychotic, I mean, suffering from severe schizophrenia, and he was telling you that he was doing what he was doing because Martians landed in his neighborhood and told him to do that, and I asked you what he told you, you would say he reported that Martian landed in his neighborhood and told him to do it.
That's correct.
You'd say it that way,
I would.
but you wouldn't believe that.
I would not believe that Martians landed, no.
Now, when Mr. Dahmer reported to you that he was doing the things he was doing because he wanted to achieve A, B, and C, did you accept that as an absolute fact?
I do not accept that as an absolute fact.
What is it that Mr. Dahmer reported to you, perhaps, when he said, I used alcohol to carry out the killing of Mr. Miller because I had run out of sleeping pills and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to kill him, so I used alcohol in order to commit the act. He reported that to you.
He did.
Does that in any way change your opinion that at that moment in time, because that's what we're talking about, the time of the commission of the offense, he was suffering from the mental disease that you told us?
No, it
That
doesn't.
he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law?
No, he wanted to engage in sexual acts with that corpse, and that was the way, that is what he had to do to obtain the corpse.
So the alcohol reporting was a matter of reporting. Did it alter your opinion that if he had not had alcohol available to him, he would not have killed Mr. Miller?
It's quite possible that he would have killed him.
Was he at that time, whether he killed him or not, suffering from a mental disease?
Yes, he was.
Now, conforming or not conforming to the requirements of law doesn't mean respect for the law, does it?
No.
And
Well, I mean, most people conform their behavior because in part they've got a respect for the law.
Of course. So if a person says, I'm not going to do that because that's against the law, that person is conforming to the requirements
That's correct.
of law. If a person says, I don't care what the law says, I'm going to do what I want to do, he's not conforming to the law, correct?
Correct.
Now, if a person has a mental disease and says, I'm not going to conform to the law, that doesn't mean he's not responsible unless his capacity to conform to the law is impaired. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
And in these instances, it's your testimony that each and every time of these homicides, he had a mental disease.
Yes.
And the result of that mental disease, that it affected his capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law.
Yes.
Substantially.
Yes.
And that was made to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty.
I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'd have to say
Psychological
psychological.
certainty.
That's correct.
Okay, now, let's assume, hypothetically, that Mr. Smith is suffering from necrophilia, that Mr. Smith wants to kill Mr. Jones, to have sex with Mr. Jones after death. Make that assumption. That he calls Mr. Jones on the phone and invites him over to watch videos. His object is to get Mr. Jones in his apartment, on the assumption I'm giving you, in order to render him dead so he can have sex. Okay? Mr. Jones doesn't come. Is Mr. Smith still suffering from a mental disease?
Yes.
Is his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law sufficiently impaired in the abstract before Mr. Jones comes to his apartment, if his plan is to kill that man?
Yes.
The fact that Mr. Jones doesn't show up doesn't mean that the person I'm talking about who wants to do the killing is suddenly conforming his conduct to the requirements of law, does it?
No.
Now Mr. Jones comes. Mr. Jones is someone who he never saw, or he thought he saw, but it's a different Mr. Jones. And that Mr. Jones that comes in is built like me, heavy set, older. And he says, have a drink and go about your business. I don't want you. Does that mean that I forget who I've got as the bad guy, but does that mean that that fella at that time was able to conform his conduct to requirements of law?
The person did not meet his specifications in terms of the type of body that he was attracted to.
Well, he conformed to the requirements of law.
He didn't kill him.
That's right.
Okay.
Because he didn't want him.
He didn't want him.
But if he wanted him and killed him, in the hypothetical I just asked you, would he have been suffering from a mental disease to the point where he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law because the object of his mental disease was there and he was driven to carry it out?
Yes.
What if the same example, the man walks in and he has the body that he wants, and they start to talk, and they make an agreement between themselves that he says, I'm going to go now, but I'm going to be back in an hour. All right? So he lets him go, he comes back an hour, and then he kills him. What has been the relative difference between the defendant's responsibility in those two instances, one giving him an hour's leeway, and then when he comes back, killing him? Is he still impaired?
Yes,
Same degree of impairment?
yes.
He didn't carry out the homicide, therefore he conformed his conduct to the requirements of law.
Let me make sure I have this right, Mr. Brill. The person came back and he ultimately rendered him comatose, killed him, and had sex with him.
Yes.
The disorder is still there.
But how about him giving him an hour furlough? What happens to the conformity when he's given him an hour's furlough? It has no meaning, does it?
No.
Of course. Do you believe that Jeffrey Dahmer killed, based upon all the reports he gave to you, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty? Do you believe that Jeffrey Dahmer was killing because he wanted the people to stay with him?
I believe that Jeffrey Dahmer killed his victims because he is interested in engaging in sexual acts with either a total corpse or body parts of someone who's not living.
Doctor, we're hearing a homicide case, 15 of them. Jeffrey Dahmer had a necrophilia, which, in your opinion, was a mental disease.
Yes.
It is against the law, is it not, to give someone pills against their will?
Yes, it is.
It is against the law to rape and to sexually assault a human being under any occasion, correct?
Yes.
When Jeffrey Dahmer, let me ask you this hypothetical. Let's assume that Jeffrey Dahmer, suffering from this mental disease to the same degree that you've told us, had rendered somebody comatose, had sex with them, and the moment after he had sex with them, the moment after, before he was able to kill that person, the moment after, Jeffrey Dahmer died of a heart attack. Would he, in rendering that person comatose for the purposes of sexually assaulting them, changed his mental disease at all? He still would have mental disease.
That's correct.
The object of his paraphilia would have been, as you have expressed it, to have sex when they're comatose and sex when they're dead. Let's take away the dead. He wasn't able to complete the death act because he died. Would he have been responsible for the sex act that he did, or would that have been the product of his mental disease?
It would have been the product of his mental disease.
So he would have been substantially impaired, not to be able to conform to the conduct or requirements of the law when he decided that in the course of his objects he was going to do a number of things. One, render him comatose, have sex with him, and then kill him and have sex with him.
Correct.
So if he wasn't able to complete the killing because he died, he still would have been impaired substantially in the giving of him the pills and in the sexual assault.
That's correct.
And that's to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty.
It is.
At any time, with all the experience you've had in talking to paraphilias, people with severe paraphilic disorders, diseased or not diseased, a lot of people, I assume, have told you fanciful stories. They've malingered, they've made up things.
Yes.
Did you ever find Jeffrey Dahmer inventing a psychosis to convince you that he was psychotic?
I did not.
Did he ever falsify symptoms, in your professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
It's my opinion that he did not falsify symptoms.
You are not suggesting, doctor, that every single person that he ever came in contact with, who he thought of as an object of his desires, was going to be dead if he got together with that person?
No.
It's when he got together with the person that he desired and committed the homicide. It's your testimony that at that time of that act, he met the standard.
Mr. Boyle, what I'm saying is that he had a certain mindset about the type of people that he was attracted to and their bodies that he was attracted to. And so if he came into contact with a person to whom he was attracted and wanted their body or body parts, because of the nature of the disease that he had, he could not conform his conduct.
There was a question asked of you relative to a gentleman, a black gentleman that he met in Chicago when he was on a vacation. It was the one that was read to you, page 20. You don't have to go into it. They went back to his apartment, and Mr. Dahmer drugged him. He stated that for some reason he did not do anything else. He just masturbated and kissed the guy, and the guy left. Remember that one?
Yes, I do.
He did not kill this man. And he told you why he did not kill this man. And the words that you read yesterday, and I believe Ms. Smith read today, was he felt... Miss White, I'm so sorry. How did I do that? I apologize. Examples, I think. He did not kill this man, and he felt that it might be that he was not as attracted to him as he thought he would be.
That's
right?
correct.
Now, that certainly puts that man in a completely different category than anyone else that we're talking about who ended up as homicides, correct?
I believe that it does.
Did he ever tell you that I killed the guy after having sex with him, but I didn't find him attractive, so I killed him anyway? He never told you that.
No, he did not.
Let me just check this out. You were asked a question about Flowers, Mr. Flowers, who escaped this potentially unfortunate incident to happen to others, right?
Yes, I was.
Grandmother sees him, Flowers lives, correct?
Correct.
Counteract symptomazone is seen by the police and citizens, but he dies.
Yes.
Can you explain the difference?
I did not ask Jeffrey Dahmer what the difference was between the two, so
Okay, that's fair.
Okay.
I have a note here, and I'm almost finished. I want to ask you about the DSM book. This part about the cautionary part of it, correct? Isn't that cautionary part to make sure that people just don't say that everything in that book is automatically integrated into the law?
I think that's a fair statement to make.
Now, assume that a person has this necrophilia and decides that what I'm going to do is to get a job at the county morgue. And they work at the county morgue, and I really want to make it absolutely clear, I'm not suggesting this happens at all. I have no idea, but I have to use an example where a person would come in contact with dead bodies. And they work at that morgue, and they act out some of their fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean they have a mental disease, does it?
Well, if a person has sex with a dead body...
I didn't say they had sex. They just work.
Oh, I'm sorry. They just work there. No.
They've got fantasies about it, but they never do anything about it.
And they're not distressed by these fantasies.
Yeah, it's like a person who maybe is pulled to look at at centerfolds and magazines, but they really want to do that, but it's something they just do. They still go about their business of working and everything. Let's make the assumption of the person who wants to work in a place where they can see corpses, and they just see them. They don't do anything to them.
Okay.
That's still a necrophiliac?
It's a necrophiliac if the person acts on the urges or is distressed by them. But if it doesn't bother them and they don't touch the bodies there, then that would not meet criteria for diagnosis.
What about the person who continues to have sex, continues to do things with the dead body, more and more different things, more and more frequent things? They initially start, this is an assumption, they start touching the body once 1 month, and then next month they're doing it 3 times a month, and the following month they're starting to try and have relations, and now they're starting to take body parts, and now they're doing more and more. What about the progression of that person within the confines of the paraphilic of his necrophilia?
If you act on the urges, okay, then you meet criteria for diagnosis.
And when it becomes more often and more often and more often, what, as a clinical psychologist, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, are you starting to conclude about that person?
That the person, that first of all, they're not able, people should not be having sex or touching dead bodies for sexual purposes. And what I would conclude is that they've lost control over time, the fantasies have intensified, and they're not able to control their behavior relative to the corpse.
That person may very well have a mental disease.
Yes.
That's it. Thank you.
Ms. White?
Just very briefly. Dr. Becker, Mr. Boyle gave you one hypothetical about Jeffrey Dahmer not having or using alcohol during any one of these killings. There is no evidence in any of his reports that alcohol was not involved in any one of those killings, is there?
I think it's fair to say that's correct. My understanding is that when weekends came, that he would consume up to 24 cans of beer.
All right, so, and these homicides occurred on weekends, correct?
Correct.
You also, or Mr. Boyle also, indicated that with the last black male, that the explanation for that person not dying, although Jeffrey Dahmer first says, I didn't kill him, he may not have been attractive enough, that's an acceptable explanation for his not dying, correct?
I would say that's acceptable. I don't know if that's the actual reason, but that would be one interpretation.
Well, doctor, if that man fits his body type, and it's not that he's unattractive enough, and Jeffrey Dahmer has no other reason, then indeed we have the perfect situation, and he conforms his conduct and doesn't kill, correct?
You know, we're talking about a hypothetical where there is a person who he's attracted to and brings him to his home and
drugs
then
him.
does not kill this person.
Right.
Okay. He's not violated the law in doing that.
He's conformed his conduct
As
to
long
the
as he's not
requirements.
drugged them or anything else.
Okay, he's conformed his, no, he has drugged him. He said he drugged this man. Because we're dealing, are we not, with responsibility for the act of killing here, correct?
Correct.
Not motivation for killing, correct? You understand there is a distinction between those two, correct?
Between why he
Motivation
decided
for
to kill
killing.
and the act of killing.
Why he decided to kill and whether or not he's responsible for the act of killing. There are two different things, correct?
Correct.
And going back to my hypothetical, if he decided to kill because he didn't want a witness, then he's responsible, correct?
Well, again, I have to say I don't like hypotheticals because there's a lot of other things that have to be taken into consideration. And I'm much more comfortable, Ms. White, just with dealing, with what he did.
Let me go back to the question I asked, and I believe you answered, because Mr. Boyles asked hypotheticals, and
I didn't like it when he asked me either, so.
I know. I guess that's one of the things that happens. But let me go back, and I believe I'm repeating your answer. If his motivation for extinguishing the human life was to get rid of the witness to the fact that he drugged them and used them sexually, that act he is responsible for, correct?
Given that the person was not psychotic.
Right, and Jeffrey Dahmer, we're assuming non-psychosis, just as in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer.
He killed somebody just so that that person would not be able to tell that he had drugged them and had sex with them, and he was not interested in doing things sexually with the body after the act.
Right.
Correct.
So he is responsible. And that person also, we assume, understands the difference between right and wrong in the act of killing.
You want me to assume that that person understood?
Yes. And that person's responsible.
Yes.
Jeffrey Dahmer, however, you are saying is not responsible for that act of killing, although he knows the difference between right and wrong. He does not derive pleasure from the act of killing, but because there is something sexual he wishes to do with the dead body afterwards, that makes him non-responsible, correct?
Can I can answer that yes or no, but I'd like to be able to explain it.
All right,
What would you like me to do?
Start with the yes or no.
Okay. The answer is that makes him not responsible.
Okay.
May I explain it, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. In my opinion, the nature of the disease that he has is such that the killing has to occur so that he is driven to have sex with a dead corpse or body parts. And to get to that point, the person has to be dead.
Okay. A dead corpse or body parts, as long as they are attractive?
Very specific.
Very specific, attractive.
Male and young.
Male, young, don't have cars, because, okay, male, young, don't have cars on a weekend when he's got time. After consuming alcohol. I think you have to answer aloud.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, so far to everything Ms. White has said.
Okay. Very, very specific. In other words, we know he's not responsible for these 15 deaths because these 15 people died, correct?
Do I have to say yes or no to that?
I'd like you to.
Yeah. Part of why he is not responsible is because these 15 people died.
And indeed, he indicated early on in some of his reports that at least one of them, David Thomas, he killed because he was afraid he'd wake up and be pissed off. He wasn't particularly attracted to him. That was early in his confession, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And you don't believe that, do you?
I do not believe all of what Jeffrey Dahmer told me related to why he did what he did.
Just one other thing, the paraphilic actions that you described late yesterday that you developed in your last interview with Jeffrey Dahmer. In that regard, Dr. Berlin was right there with you during the conversation?
He was in the room with me.
Okay, and as far as you know, participating in the conversation and hearing it?
Did he hear what I had to say?
What you had to say and what Jeffrey Dahmer had to say?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's all. Thank you again, Doctor.
Just two questions.
Well,
Doctor, it was clear that when I asked you about this drinking episode, it's because it came up in the case of Mr. Miller. I wasn't in any way trying to imply that drinking was just limited to that. It's because you were asked questions about the Miller incident and the stabbing that I raised that question.
Objection. She can't comment on his motivation.
Well, I want to ask, that was just a foundation to this question.
I think it was a short speech.
Well, it was. It wasn't a real long speech. It was a short speech, I agree.
apparently we have a stipulation, it was a short speech.
Okay.
Doctor, the drinking that we're talking about in reference to Mr. Miller, did the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer told you that he had a drink in order to use the knife to cut the jugular vein of Mr. Miller, did that in any way alter your opinion that he was not responsible for that killing?
No.
The fact of the absence or the presence of drinking in any of the other homicides, is that a major factor in your decision that he was not mentally responsible?
No, even if Mr. Dahmer did not drink, he still would have necrophilia.
Doctor, Mr. Dahmer, you were asked a question by Ms. White about the homicide. If the homicide did not take place, would he have not been responsible? And your answer was, in part. You made the answer. There was another part. What was the other part you wanted to express?
It's my opinion, which I've stated a number of times, is that he has a mental disease, and that is what drives his behavior.
Doctor, Mr. Dahmer reported to you time and time again that he placed these people in a comatose state, correct?
Yes.
That while in a comatose state, he had sex with them?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I believe we're beyond the bounds of redirect at this point.
I think that my next question will show the reason I had to lay that
Okay,
foundation.
just let me make clear that the scope is limited at this point to the scope of the
And
cross-examination.
I absolutely understand that, and I think the next question, first two were foundations to the question that came up in recross. Why, before the act of murder, homicide, did Mr. Dahmer report to you that he put these people in a comatose state?
Objection. Irrelevant to cross.
She opened up the door in her redirect, or recross.
Just a minute, I haven't asked for any argument.
Yes, that's right.
I'll allow the question. Objection's overruled.
Why did he tell me that he would put people into a comatose state? For a couple of reasons. One, because it was much more arousing to him to be sexual with a person who was comatose, and that he had control over the person.
And
Also, that he didn't, I mean, if you want me to go on, there
I
are
do.
a number of things he said, and they are in my notes. That he didn't have to entertain the person, that he didn't have to have very much in the way of interaction with the person.
And did he in any way indicate to you about his not wanting them to be conscious when he killed them?
He's told me that he didn't want, and this sounds unusual, but that he didn't want his victims to be in pain.
And each and every one of the persons were unconscious at the time of death. as far as you know from what he reported to you?
In relation to the 15 cases
Yes, ma'am.
here, that's what my recollection is.
No, Your Honor, thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Wallstrom.
Good morning.
You are a doctor of medicine.
That's correct.
You will reside where?
I reside in Oak Park, Illinois.
And where did you go to undergraduate school?
I went to the University of Illinois in Chicago.
You have in front of you what we call a curriculum vitae, which is a short story of your life and career.
That's correct.
You can feel free to look at that and help us move this along, okay?
Yes.
Oh, don't you have a copy of Dr. Wallstrom's? Doctor, you graduated from the University of Illinois, and what years were you there, please?
I was there from 1969 through 1974, and then I returned in 1980 to 1981.
And what was the reason for the 2 times that you were there?
The first time I was there, I studied psychology, and I returned in 1980 to pursue the requirements to study medicine.
So you were there in a pre-med basis in 80 and 81?
That's correct.
Did you receive your undergraduate degree in 1974?
Yes, I did.
And that was as a degree in psychology?
Yes, it was.
Did you graduate with any distinctions from the institution?
Yes, I did. I graduated with honors in the liberal arts and distinction in psychology.
Okay. Subsequent to graduating from undergraduate school, before you went back to go to pre-med, did you go on to further graduate education?
Yes, I did. While I was working for the Illinois Department of Mental Health, I pursued graduate courses in counseling psychology.
And where was that at? What institution?
That was at the Illinois Institute of Technology.
And how long were you there for that?
I was there for 2 years.
And you then returned and went to medical school.
That's correct.
After completing, what, did you have to go back to undergraduate school to get your sciences?
Yes.
And then when you entered medical school, what medical school did you go to?
I entered Rush Medical College in Chicago.
Where is that located?
Chicago, Illinois.
Yeah, but where in Chicago?
It's just west of the downtown area in the what's called the Medical Center Complex.
Is that where Cook County Medical?
Cook County and University of Illinois Medical Hospital.
Tell us what kind of a school Rush Medical College is, please. What kind of an institution is it?
It's a private hospital and medical college. It's not for profit.
So the medical school is part of the hospital also?
Yes.
What is the hospital called?
Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center.
Now, how does it get to be Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center? Was there a merger?
There's a long history of mergers. I think the institution dates back 150 years, and there have been a number of mergers, yes.
How about the medical college, Rush Medical College? How long has that been in existence?
Greater than 100 years.
And what type, how large of a medical college is it?
The medical school class in each year is approximately 100 to 120 students.
So it's quite a large medical school.
Yes.
When did you go to school there, please?
I went there from 1986 through 1990.
And what year did you get your Doctor of Medicine?
In 1990, in June.
And as I'm looking at your medical dates, I see 82 to 86 for being at medical school. Am I misreading that?
Oh, no. You're reading that correctly. I'm sorry. That is correct, 1982 to 1986.
So you became a Doctor of Medicine in 1986?
Yes, in June of 1986.
Okay.
That's correct.
Now, while at that medical school, by the way, is your license to practice your profession on file with the proper authorities in the state of Illinois?
Yes, it is.
Did you receive any awards while at medical school, please?
Yes, I did. I received the Sandoz Award, which was a recognition for superior academic achievement and contribution to healthcare.
And did you do any research while you were a medical student during the years 82 to 86? And if so, basically what kind of research, if at all?
I was involved in clinical research projects where patients would come in and would be evaluated as to their response on various medications that were in various stages of clinical trials in being approved for broader use.
Okay, but these were the kind of things that were particular to doctors of medicine who are not yet specialists, right?
Well, the research that I did was actually all in the Department of Psychiatry.
Okay, so while a medical student, you were working for the Department of Psychiatry?
On an elective basis, yes.
Sure. When you say elected, that was part of your training or volunteer?
It was part of my training at one point, and I received a small stipend for the summer, I think of '85.
When you graduated from medical school, did you choose a specialty?
Yes, I did.
And what was that specialty?
That specialty was psychiatry.
Now, you've had psychology degree at this time.
Previously an undergraduate degree in psychology, yes.
So, did you have a master's in psychology?
No, I didn't. I had about half the credits as a student at large at IIT towards a master's.
And that's when you decided to go to medical school?
Yes.
Was your aim to become a psychiatrist?
Yes, it was.
By graduating from medical school, you went into psychiatric residency. How long of a residency is that?
Well, it's a combined internship and residency, and it lasts 4 years.
Some residencies are short in duration and some are long. How long is a 4-year psychiatric residency? How is that considered, like a general surgeon residency or a pulmonary specialist?
Okay. A family practice residency would be 3 years. An internal medicine residency would also, I believe, be 3 years. A surgery residency would be 5 years.
So you're on somewhere in the middle scale as far as length of time to get.
Yeah.
After you finish your residency, what, if anything, are you allowed to do upon the completion of the 4-year residency? Are you automatically allowed to be a psychiatrist, or do you have to do something in order to be able to say, I'm now a psychiatrist?
You have to complete 3 years of training in psychiatry to be eligible to be practicing psychiatry.
Are you being watched during that period of time?
Very closely.
What if you didn't do a good job? Let's say that the 3 years that you're in residency, at the end they don't like you. What happens to you?
Then I'm not here today.
Okay, so you're not allowed to say you're a psychiatrist then?
You would not be allowed to finish the program.
Okay. You graduated or you finished that program. It's not called graduation, is it?
It's postgraduate education. You do graduate.
All right. So when did you receive the completion of your psychiatric residency studies? When was that?
That was in June of 1990.
So basically, you're almost going on a second anniversary of you being able to say you're a psychiatrist.
Yes, although I finished 3 years of training in January of 1990, so it's actually been a little over 2 years that
Already.
I finished at minimum requirement.
Where did you take your residency at?
The residency was at the Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center Department of Psychiatry.
When you were a senior, did you have the ability to choose electives, and I'm talking about electives within the field of psychiatry?
Yes, you are.
And when you say senior electives, is that in your last year of residency?
Yes, it is.
So your senior year of residency?
Yes.
Your 4th year?
Yes.
What did you choose?
I chose research methods, I chose medical student teaching, and I chose forensic psychiatry.
What research methods were you studying?
Studying the basic statistical foundations for research, experimental design, and going through some research that had been done and what methods were followed, and examining those
For what
methods.
area of psychiatry? General psychiatry?
It was more oriented towards biological psychiatry.
You taught medical student teaching, you mean you went to the medical school and taught like as an assistant teacher?
The medical students are required to take a 6-week rotation on the floors in general psychiatry, and they are supervised very closely as far as their education goes. I both monitored their following of patients, interviewing of patients, and instructing them in didactic material relevant to what they were trying to learn.
You also took a senior elective, and when you say a senior elective, is that an elective that you take for the whole year of study? Or is that?
You may or may not.
Okay. You also took one in forensic psychiatry.
That's correct.
What is that, and why did you take that?
Forensic psychiatry is the study of the application of general psychiatry principles to helping the legal system answer questions that come up.
So it's a merging of the two different disciplines.
Yes.
Tell us the activities while you were in your psychiatric residency that you became involved in that might be helpful to let this jury know about you as a person about to testify.
Well, the activities involved intensive training on the inpatient hospital units in psychiatry. So evaluating and treating more seriously ill mental patients that are requiring hospitalization. Studying internal medicine, so there's a basic medical foundation and a basic medical knowledge of illness. Studying neurology, so there's an understanding of the neurological sciences and an ability to recognize what is a neurological, at least on a general level versus a psychiatric illness. I worked on the consult liaison service, and what that is that's the service where psychiatrists go to other parts of the hospital. So sometimes someone undergoing surgery is having something that's thought to be a psychiatric difficulty, or someone in medicine is having some kind of mental problem or adjustment disorder, and you learn how to evaluate those kind of patients and assist the staff in managing them.
Did you spend any time doing any outpatient psychiatric work?
Yes, I spent 2 years of outpatient psychiatric work.
While you were in your residency?
That's correct.
What does that mean, you spent that? Is that part of the program?
That's built into the program, that you both work with inpatients and outpatients.
And what did you do relative to any investigation work and any treatment research matters in the institution?
There were a number of investigational drugs. That is, there are several phases of investigation that the FDA requires before any new drug goes onto the market. And in major medical centers where they're studying those drugs to see whether they are safe and whether they are effective and whether they offer some additional benefit in treating illnesses, psychiatric illnesses. And I was involved as a co-investigator on several studies there.
Doctor, while you were a student at Rush Presbyterian Hospital Medical Complex doing your studying in psychiatry, how many other people like you, male or females, were also studying psychiatry? How many people were in that program, the residency program?
There were 20 in that program.
20 in all 3 years or in each year?
In the 4 years. So there were 5. The range was 7 to, I think 1 year had 4. So if someone had gone into a child fellowship a year early. So approximately 5 though per year.
Now, while you were there, did you receive any achievements relative to a view of your intellectual abilities by a recognition of how you did in exams?
Yes, I did. I was acknowledged personally by the residency director for having the highest score on a national exam in the program itself for 2 years in a row. In my 3rd year in psychiatry, I was at the 99th percentile in general psychiatry nationwide. So
there's an exam that's given to everybody who's in the field of studying psychiatry. Now, I'm the one that forces you to answer these, so don't be modest. Everybody in the nation takes an examination, and you had the highest score in the nation?
I was in the 99th percentile, which means there's 1 percentile that is higher, or that is the top 1 percentile.
Okay, thank you. Now, after graduating from undergraduate school and after receiving your graduate recognition in the field of psychiatry, what postgraduate education did you pursue subsequent to that?
I pursued a postgraduate training fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
And that was one that started upon your graduation from, not graduation, from the recognition that you've completed your residency program?
That's correct.
And how long did that postgraduate education fellowship continue?
That was a one-year fellowship.
And is that a normal span of time for that kind of fellowship?
Yes, it is.
And what field was it in psychiatry?
That's in forensic psychiatry, which is a subspecialty of general psychiatry.
And that went from July of 90 to July of 91?
That's correct.
Who did you study under that fellowship? Was there anybody in particular?
Yeah, there were three forensic psychiatrists that I trained under. Dr. James Kavanaugh was the head of the program. Dr. John Kelly, Dr. Katie Bush, and those were the three that primarily gave me training in the year.
Within the field of psychiatry, within the field of forensic psychiatry, these are well-known people and well-respected?
They're all very well-respected.
What activities during this postgraduate education, what activities did you participate in that might be relevant to the issues that are before this court and jury?
Okay, I participated in various activities related to the interface between psychiatry and the law. There is a center there.
Let me just interrupt there. What is this? That's what forensic means, isn't it? The interfacing of psychiatry and the law.
As far as it relates to forensic psychiatry, that's
Tell
true.
us what that means. I mean, we know psychiatrists do their things, and some are called forensic psychiatrists. What is the interfacing? Where is that necessary? So that you understand the legal process and apply psychiatric processes to the legal process?
That's correct, and it's getting in. There are many types of questions that can be asked, and focusing in on what is known about that and what the standard good workups are for that kind of process. How to go about working up someone that is having the insanity defense, or someone who's unfit to stand trial, or maybe are they fit to waive Miranda rights? Is this...
Miranda rights mean are they fit to waive the right to waive their constitutional right?
That's correct.
How about a person where the question is this person can make a will?
That's a section of civil forensic psychiatry, and that is also part of it. That's another form of competency. Can someone make a will?
So what the forensic psychiatrist then learns is what it takes to be able to make a will, and as a psychiatrist, what I would look at to be able to answer the questions of whether this person was able to make a will or not to make a will.
That's correct.
And that's what the interfacing is.
Yes.
In other words, it's doctors learning what lawyers are thinking and lawyers trying to understand what doctors are thinking, and that's the interface.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Tell me what kind of training did you receive relative then to what we're doing here in this courtroom on the basis of this insanity defense that you want to tell us about that caused you to believe that you have some understanding of what we're here for?
Okay, two things. One is there is a sexually disordered offenders clinic there at the Isaac Ray Center. And
Tell us what Isaac Ray Center is.
The Isaac Ray Center is a subsection of the section on psychiatry in the law in the Department of Psychiatry at Rush Presbyterian.
And tell us what you did relative to that.
Okay.
Training.
Part of my training was to work with sexually disordered individuals, primarily, essentially paraphilias. And they work them up to determine the presence and the extent of the illness, and then whether treatment is indicated or available. I followed numerous patients. I was in on a weekly staff meeting regarding the treatment of all the patients that were in the clinic.
Did you also work in any institute in your area of work that dealt with determining a person's fitness to stand trial?
Yes, I did.
Okay, tell us about that.
Yes, that was both at the Isaac Ray Center. We would get federal and local cases, county cases, from various counties surrounding either Chicago or the neighboring counties that
From
had...
where? Courts?
Yeah, from the courts. From the courts or from the defense attorneys or from the state's attorneys. It could be from anyone. And we would work them up and help them answer that question, whether they were either competent if it was the federal court or fit to stand trial if it was the state court.
They're basically the same thing?
Yes.
Just call it different?
They do, yeah.
When you say you worked them up, did you do that by also talking to the person who was questionable? Did you talk to the patient,
Oh, absolutely.
who would have been the defendant?
Yes.
And so you made inquiries, did you get data and information and records and things like that to study?
Yes, you would get records, you would get data. If psychological testing was appropriate, you would ask for that. You would interview the patient.
Okay, so you did that during your postgraduate studies?
Yes, I did.
How many such people did you talk to relative to the kind of questions of their either competency to stand trial or their ability to understand what was happening in the courtroom, or whether or not they were mentally diseased or not at the time of the incident?
In that year of training, I would say 40 altogether, and it did include one other setting, 40 to 50, and also included the Psychiatric Institute of the Cook County of the Circuit Court of Cook County.
You did that also?
Yes.
Okay. Did you do any teaching during this time at any institutions of higher learning that are classified as law schools?
Yes, I did.
Where and what did you teach?
That was at the DePaul Law School. I was invited as a guest lecturer in the field of correctional psychiatry.
Did you teach psychiatric residents and medical students anything relative to this area that you've been talking about here as it relates to the insanity defense?
I taught them regarding the fitness issues during that year of training.
Fitness?
Fitness,
Rather
not
than-
insanity, but fitness.
Fitness to stand trial?
Yes.
Now, there is a thing called board-certified psychiatrists. Are you familiar with the term?
Yes, I am.
Are you board-certified?
No, I'm not.
And have you, why are you not board-certified?
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to take the second part of the test. It hasn't been offered to me and will not be offered until June of this year. I'm scheduled to take it. I took the first part, which is the written part, and passed that.
So you're halfway there.
Yes.
Are you on track? I mean, you are not an older psychiatrist, you are a younger psychiatrist. Are you on track now to take that board certification test?
I've never missed an opportunity to take the test. I've taken them as soon as possible.
So you're doing it as you can,
Yes,
as is offered because of your youthfulness, right?
that's correct.
Okay. What is your, have you had occasion to speak to any groups concerning your field of psychiatry, reference anything that would be relative to what we're talking about here in this court? At the law school or wherever?
That would be at the law school, and that would be in the area of correctional psychiatry, would be most specifically relating to what we're talking to today.
Doctor, tell us your memberships, please.
I have membership in the American Psychiatric Association, the Illinois Psychiatric Association, the Mental Health Association of Greater Chicago, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and the local Midwest chapter of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law.
Tell us your hospital staff appointments, please.
I am an adjunct attending in the Department of Psychiatry at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center.
What does an adjunct attending mean?
That means that I'm allowed to admit, work up, follow, and discharge patients in the Department of Psychiatry.
And what academic appointments do you have?
I'm an instructor in psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at Rush Presbyterian.
Doctor, have you worked in any prison settings or any correctional institution that has anything to do with mentally ill persons?
Yes, I have.
And tell us about that.
I've worked for 3 years in a maximum security institution in Illinois as a psychiatrist.
And doing what?
In treating, evaluating mentally disordered, violent or nonviolent offenders.
Have you participated in any workshops put on by the federal government within your specialty?
Yes, I have.
Tell us what that was.
I was a participant in a program that the Secret Service put on in the Chicago area that was looking at how can we best interview and evaluate someone we think is mentally ill and threatening the president's life.
Have you ever been asked to do anything reference to the American Academy of Psychiatry and the law, that organization? Are you currently doing anything on their behalf?
Well, in general, they've asked me to participate in workshops and to write papers as is appropriate. The other thing, the Midwest chapter, which covers the Midwest states, has asked me to be the program director for the next year's Midwest Conference.
You doing any present research?
Yes, I am.
What kind of research?
I'm working in sex offender or disorder research, specifically looking at the outcome of patients with paraphilias, sexual disorders, that we have given a drug that lowers the sex hormone testosterone to see what the outcome of that is.
Doctor, what portion of psychiatry is becoming your area of interest? Do you understand what I mean by that?
Well, I have a number of interests in psychiatry. I can talk about them.
Please.
My strongest interest is in that of general clinical psychiatry, and that is evaluating and treating mentally ill people. I will always do that as an active part of my practice. I see 30 to 40 patients every week.
Do you see them as part of your hospital assignment, as part of your private? You're also in private practice?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
I see them as part of my private practice. I see them as part of the work I do in the community, and I see them in the prison that I work at.
Are you doing any studies into the area of sexual disorders?
The study that I just mentioned regarding looking at the outcome of treatment with medications to control sexual drive.
Have you been dealing with any people who are afflicted with what has been come to know by everybody in this courtroom as paraphilias?
Yes, I have.
Tell us about that.
The extensive involvement and training with the paraphilias has been in the area primarily of pedophilia and secondarily exhibitionism. So people that have an abnormal fantasies or to the extreme driven to act on behaviors involving a sexual attraction to children, people that are driven to expose themselves out in public.
And is that because you're concentrating on sexual disorders, or they just come to you in a normal course of events?
That was because it was part of my training and part of my interest in treating these very difficult problems.
Have you ever testified in a court of law and been able to render an expert opinion as to whether or not a person in question was or was not suffering from a mental disease?
Yes, I have.
And how many times have you done that?
Suffering from a mental disease, one time.
And where was that at?
That was in Wisconsin.
And what court was that in the state of Wisconsin? What county?
I think that was in Waukesha County, I believe.
Were you accepted as an expert in that court case?
Yes, I was.
Have you ever been proffered as an expert and been rejected by a court?
No, I've not.
Have you been called upon to render an expert opinion in court relative to your specialty of psychiatry, relative to the mental condition of another person?
Yes, I am.
And how many times other than the one in Wisconsin?
another one in Wisconsin, and 2 more in Illinois.
You licensed to practice your profession in Wisconsin?
No, I'm not.
But you were accepted as an expert because of your foundation questions, the type of which I asked.
Yes.
Now, have you ever been able, or have you been called upon by any court to render an evaluation other than testifying to that court as it relates to whether or not a person who you have examined was or was not suffering from a mental disease or defect?
Yes, I have.
And how did that come about?
Well, that comes about in 2 ways. In one way, it came about through my work at the Isaac Ray Center in the section on psychiatry and the law, where we would be consulted by either side or by the court to render an opinion on oftentimes the issue of fitness or competence to stand trial. Many times those reports are stipulated to.
And what you mean they're stipulated to, there's no reason for you to testify?
They accept what you've said and they don't ask you to come in. And at the Psychiatric Institute in Chicago, connected with the Circuit Court of Cook County, I would have rendered that kind of opinion at least 50 times.
Has your opinion ever been rendered, been sent back to you and found not to be acceptable?
No, it is not.
Have you ever testified in a homicide case?
No, I have not.
Have you ever been involved in a homicide case where you worked the case as a psychiatrist?
Yes, I have.
And tell us about that.
That was a case in Illinois, in Cook County, involving the murder of 2 women that someone was claiming to be insane during those serial, meaning that they were separated in time, those 2 murders. The state approached the Isaac Ray Center, and I was involved in that evaluation. I wrote a report. I worked with Dr. James Kavanaugh on that case extensively. Did
you render an opinion as to whether or not the defendant at the time of the commission of the offense was or was not suffering from a mental illness?
I did.
And was that part of your job, hired through the Institute under the guidance of Dr. Kavanaugh?
Yes, it was.
And that was by the state?
It was by the state, yes.
They hired you?
They did.
Have you made these evaluations only on behalf of either the state or the court or the defense? And if so, what proportion of the time? Who is it that's calling upon you to render these 50 evaluations you're talking about?
The court, at least 80% of the time, maybe 90%. The defense, these are rough estimates, maybe 10%, the state or federal, 10%.
Can you tell us, based upon the number of interviews you have made concerning whether or not someone is suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the commission of the offense, how many times did you make such a finding that that person was suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the commission of the offense?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. I'm asking you, what percentage of the time did you say the person was suffering as opposed to how many times you say they weren't suffering from a mental disease?
Okay. I've offered the opinion that someone meets the underlying criteria for insanity very, very seldom, less than 5% of those cases.
I'm ready to proffer Dr. as a witness.
Mr. McCann, voir dire.
Doctor, I'm going to ask a number of questions because the jury has a right to have this information. I don't want you to take it personally. Do you understand that?
Yes.
You are about 40 years of age, is that correct?
That's correct.
And looking at you, one might assume that you've been in practice for some time because many people who graduate from medical school and training would be younger than you, is that correct?
That is correct.
But the fact is you are really actually recently completed your training. Wouldn't that be true?
I'm about a year and a half into practice.
Right. Is the fellowship part of the training?
How do you mean?
The fellowship. Is the fellowship that you had at the Isaac Ray Center part of your training?
It's an elective part of training that was not required.
All right. When did you finish the fellowship at the Isaac Gray Center?
In July of 91.
All right. And if that's part of your training, the fellowship, and you finished it in July of 91, you have been out of training less than 7 months. Would that be true?
I've been practicing psychiatry for 2 years.
Let me repeat the question. If the fellowship is part of your training, as you said it was, and you finished the fellowship in July of 91, you have been out of training less than a year. Is that accurate?
I've been out of formal training or pursuing any formal training for less than 1 year.
All right, so you're recently out of training. Have you ever testified on responsibility in your experience?
Yes, I am.
And what type of case was that?
That was a sex offense.
And what was it? What was the case?
It was a case of exhibitionism.
And where was it?
It was in Wisconsin.
All right. Have you ever testified, was that charged as a disorderly case or an L&L type case?
Lewd and lascivious.
And who did you testify for, the defendant?
Yes.
Did you ever testify on responsibility in any other case? Here or in Illinois?
No, I have not.
Have you ever testified in any state on any case of responsibility other than the L&L case in Wisconsin?
No, I have not.
That's a misdemeanor, isn't it, L&L? It means a person exposed themselves. That's basically was the issue, wasn't it?
Yes.
Just so the jury understands, you never testified on responsibility on a burglary case, did you?
No, I did not.
You never testified on responsibility on a robbery case?
No, I did not.
Never testified on responsibility on a rape case?
That's correct.
Never testified in responsibility on a murder case?
That's correct.
Are you a bit astonished to find yourself testifying in responsibility on 15 counts of murder?
I would object to the form of that question as being argumentative, immaterial, and irrelevant.
I'll withdraw the question. The things you've talked about, the particular honors, are the honors you received as a student, is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you on any committees of the American Medical Association?
I'm not a member of the American Medical Association.
Are you on any committees of the American Psychiatric Association?
No, I'm not.
Have you ever addressed the American Psychiatric Association?
No, I have not.
Have you published any papers?
No, I have not.
There is no paper published under your name.
That's correct.
That murder case that you talked about, that you did a workup, you were under the direction of Dr. James Kavanaugh, is that correct?
That's correct.
And he is the director of the Isaac Ray Institute, is he not?
Yes, he is.
And did the what you did was under his direction, his observation, and he checked out what you did. Is that accurate?
Well, I interviewed the defendant in that case independently 3 or 4 times. I reviewed all the records, and then I had a meeting with Dr. Kavanaugh, and then he interviewed the defendant twice, and we wrote a joint report.
But there's no question who was in charge here. Dr. Kavanaugh was in charge, wasn't he, in that particular situation?
I think we were working together.
Let me repeat it. Who was it? He was in charge of the clinic, was he not?
He was a director of the Isaac Ray Center.
And were you a director also of the Isaac Ray Center?
No, not if I was in training.
So you were under him, were you not?
He was my boss.
When Mr. Boyle asked you about teaching, you said, and he had suggested you had taught at DePaul. You went there once and lectured at the DePaul Law School, is that correct?
No, I went there twice.
Twice?
Yes.
Okay. You're not a lecturer at the DePaul Law School, are you?
I'm a guest lecturer.
Right, because you've lectured there twice.
Correct.
And was the case that you testified in Wisconsin, the L&L case, did that go to a jury trial?
No, it did not.
Is this the first time you've ever testified in front of a jury?
Yes, it is.
In terms of your practice, you have not been, you're not long enough in practice to have had the time to qualify or to take the test for the boards? You haven't had sufficient time. In other words, the test hasn't rolled around. You've been so recently completed your training, that you haven't, the time for taking the test hasn't come around yet. Is that why you haven't taken the second part of the...
The first time they offered the test to me is in June of this year. I've been eligible ever since completion of my training.
And you are not board certified in psychiatry, are you?
That's correct.
And you're not board certified in forensic psychiatry,
That's
are you?
correct.
And you join these very associations that you join. Once you graduate, you pay your dues and you're admitted. Is that correct?
That is a requirement, paying your dues.
And that's how you do it. It's not an honor, the American Psychiatric Association or the American Association of Psychiatry and the Law. You don't have to achieve certain achievements in order to be admitted to those associations, do you?
You have to meet the minimum educational and ethical standards.
But beyond that, then you pay your dues and you're admitted. Is that correct?
You must pay your dues or they won't keep you as a member.
Thank you very much.
I might want to suggest to you that the jury and those who have been in the courtroom on a daily basis and the public because of the media have heard much of the data and the detail of these killings. You and I met last evening and I indicated to you that it was not necessary, at least from our presentation, to go into them except as needed by you to render your opinion, correct?
Correct.
Doctor, you have filed a report, and I've asked you to help us move this along, that you take your report and refresh your recollection as you need to, so that we can get this matter in and out before the jury and turn you over to cross-examination, right?
Okay.
I hired you to work on my behalf relative to this case.
That's correct.
And I met with you in Chicago, Illinois, and brought you certain materials and gave you certain information relative to Mr. Dahmer.
That's correct.
Subsequent to that, you took on the endeavor of talking to Mr. Dahmer to decide whether or not you could or would or wanted to be of assistance to whatever you and I had talked about.
That's right.
You indicated that you would let me know after you did your workup and what you looked at and viewed, what your opinion was, and then we'd go from there.
Yes.
Doctor, did you, as a result of that, can you tell us if there came a time when you met with Mr. Dahmer, where and when and for what period of time?
I met with Mr. Dahmer on 4 occasions. December 26th of 91, December 27th of 91, January 1st of 1992. Those were all at the Columbia Correctional Center in Portage.
That's where he was being housed, that's north of Madison.
Yes.
You met him with on New Year's Day and the day after Christmas and the day after that.
Yes, and then I met him one additional time at the Milwaukee County Jail on January 4th.
And what was the purpose of your examination?
The purpose of the examination was to evaluate the presence, nature, and extent of any mental disease or defect which might affect the defendant's mental responsibility at the time of the alleged offenses.
What were the matters that you were looking into as mental responsibility of what crimes?
There were 2 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of intentional homicide.
And that's, they were the same thing, the nomenclature was just changed.
Yes.
How long did you actually spend talking to Mr. Dahmer?
I actually spent at least 10 and a half hours.
I mean, you were there longer than 10 and a half hours, but 10 and a half hours of conversation, is that what you mean?
That's correct.
Now, prior to that examination, you and I talked sometime in December, correct?
That's correct.
And you talked to other members of my staff, my office.
Yes, I did.
Did you ask for and receive records that you thought you might want to see?
Yes, I did.
I want to ask you, Doctor, prior to the time of going to see Mr. Dahmer, you were given certain materials.
That's right.
You were given more materials as time went on.
Yes.
And you had a whole bevy of materials prior to rendering your opinion that was received on paper on January 9th, 1992.
That's correct.
Okay, would you run down and tell us what you have at your disposal prior to the time It doesn't matter whether it was before or after you talked to Mr. Dahmer, just things that you did other than talk to Mr. Dahmer for those 10 and a half hours.
Okay. I reviewed the amended criminal complaint. I reviewed the confession given by the defendant to the police.
170 pages or something.
Many pages. I reviewed the work product notes from your office, which supplemented the confession by adding additional information that had been provided by the defendant to you and your associates. I reviewed the psychological evaluation of the defendant by Kenneth Smale, PhD, clinical psychologist. I reviewed the Milwaukee Journal dated Sunday, July 28th, 1991.
Why did you review that?
Well, that gave a newspaper account of what had happened and what was known, and gave a lot of general information.
Okay, it was just for what it was worth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
The videotape of the Phil Donahue show, which featured Tracy Edwards and others.
Let me talk about that for a moment. Why did you review that videotape of the Phil Donahue show concerning Mr. Edwards?
Well, one thing that can be very important in looking at criminal responsibility is who has actually been in contact, who was threatened and, say, escaped in this case. This was the last victim or intended victim, narrowly escaped and resulted in the arrest. So I thought that certainly at that time that would be imperative to talk to him.
Did you ever subsequently, besides seeing the videotape of Mr. Donahue's show with Mr. Edwards, did you have occasion to talk to Mr. Edwards?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
That was...
Or how did that come about?
That came about on my initiation of saying that I felt it was important. I had read his narrative that he gave to the police. I had seen the videotape, and I asked to talk to him personally.
Did you do that? Talk to him personally?
Yes, I did.
Person or phone?
I'm sorry. I talked to him over the phone for about a little over an hour.
Okay. Let's continue. Let's continue on. What else did you do?
Observations by the defendant's aunt on his parents' marriage, notes from the defendant's baby book, and part of a letter she had sent to his grandparents.
What else did you see?
There were medical studies that had been done of the defendant, an EEG, a CT, and cytogenic studies.
Tell us what those three tests are.
An EEG is a brainwave study, and it's a way of looking at how the brain is functioning electrically during the time of the exam. It doesn't prove or disprove any abnormal activity, and if it is not present, it doesn't show it. If abnormal activity is observed, it does indicate the nature of that activity and give some suggestions as to what is going wrong.
That EEG was taken subsequent to Mr. Dahmer being arrested, so it was current?
It was current.
All right. How about the CT? What's that?
The CT is computerized tomography. It's a way of looking at the brain. It can actually look at any part of the body, but in his case is to look at the brain and see if there were any gross abnormalities that could be detected.
The results of both those tests, in your medical opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and or psychiatric certainty, were they within proper range?
They were both read by I would have to check exactly. My recollection is they were both read by medical people that were qualified to look at them, and they were both read as normal.
Okay, and how about the psychogenetic studies? What's that about?
That's to look at whether there is some kind of chromosomal damage.
Was there any found?
None.
Okay, let's move on. What else did you read, please?
I looked at various police documents from the time of the defendant's arrest, which included statements by Tracy Edwards and various police officers who searched the defendant's apartment and obtained collateral citizen interviews.
What else?
Various documents, both by the fire department and the police department, along with witness statements related to the Conrack synthesome phone street encounter.
Why was that important?
One of my favorite...
Important because here was an example of someone who did become a victim, who had been seen on the street, and was interacted with by the police, the fire department, the defendant, and various witnesses in the community.
Okay, what else did you?
Well, I'd like to say it was also important in some of the activities the defendant described doing to that individual and looking at the behavior to see if it was consistent with brain damage.
Okay.
I looked at the psychological evaluation of September 26, 1986 by Catherine Bowes, Master of Arts, Master of Science, supervised by David Osmond, PhD. After Mr. Dahmer was arrested on a disorderly conduct and exposing charge, along with clinical notes of mental health treatment by Evelyn Rosen, PhD, which was a condition of probation that he see her.
What else did you review?
I looked at the psychological evaluation of Charles M. Lodel, PhD, dated January 5th, 1989, related to the second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes, along with related court and police documents.
What else?
I looked at missing persons investigation of Anthony Sears, the Bath, Ohio investigation, Steve Hicks, West Dallas investigation of Flowers, and others.
What else?
I looked at the work records and notice of termination from Ambrosia Chocolate dated July 19th, 1991.
What else?
I looked at military records of the defendant. I looked at a letter to a judge from the defendant's father. I looked at the medical drug screening tests. When he was in the House of Corrections, they would test his urine or blood for the presence of any illegal substances.
For a period of about 8 months, that was.
Yeah, about 7 months.
What did they show, those tests?
It did show that one time on Thanksgiving, he tested positive for alcohol.
Other than that, they were all negative.
That's right.
Next.
The police report with the defendant as a victim of a strong-arm robbery.
That was in September of 90.
Yes.
Why was that important to look at?
To look at the context of what had been said to the police by the defendant, in what context the robbery occurred, how serious the injury was there any injury?
What else did you look at?
I looked at the Bath Township police records where the defendant was charged with having an open container and disorderly conduct and resisting arrest.
And that was in October of 81.
That's correct.
Why was that important to look at?
Well, it is known that at various times there has been offenses that have been charged where alcohol was involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next thing you looked at?
Was the Milwaukee Police Department report by the defendant again, where he was battered with an unknown object in 1988.
That was a report generated as a result of the defendant making information known to the police in November of 1988.
Yes. There was
Next one?
There was a statement by Carlos Cruz dated July 26, 1991.
Well, who is Mr. Cruz? Is that somebody that talked about sometime when he was in the Army with...
Yes.
Okay.
The police property inventory of videotapes in the defendant's apartment.
Videotapes they took out of his apartment?
Yes.
Okay.
And photographs of the victims and the defendant's apartment.
And they were like hundreds of pictures.
Yes,
some of the defendant took and kept, some that the police took of the crime.
That's correct.
And the evidence, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, armed with that information and having done the 4 days, the 10.5 hours of discussion with Mr. Dahmer, did you arrive at an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty as to whether or not Mr. Dahmer was, on each and every one of the 15 occasions where these homicides took place, suffering from a mental disease?
Yes, I did.
And what is your opinion?
That in every case he was suffering from a severely disabling mental disease.
And what did you classify that mental disease at?
I classified it as necrophilia, along with some other diagnoses.
And necrophilia is a paraphilia.
That's correct. It's classified as a paraphilia not otherwise specified because it's not a common condition.
It's not a common condition.
Yes.
Now, did you classify that necrophilia as a mental disease?
Yes, I did.
On each and every one of those occasions, you testified now to a psychiatric, reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty that he was suffering from that disease. Now I want to ask you, on each and every one of those occasions, as a result of the mental disease that you have just proffered, can you tell us whether or not you arrived in opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty as to whether or not, because of that disease, the defendant, Jeffrey Dahmer, lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
I did.
And what was your opinion?
The opinion was that secondary to a mental disease, that he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law.
Because of that mental disease, did you arrive in opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty as to whether or not on those 15 instances he lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
He was aware that the acts were illegal in every case.
We're wrong.
He said that they were illegal and he knew he could get in trouble if he was caught.
And those those three opinions you have just expressed in the manner and form in which you expressed them are to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty.
That's correct.
Was the mental disease that Jeffrey Dahmer